He crouched in the freezing wind, battered by swirling snow, when the wounded Mustang appeared out of nowhere and everything changed. Before we get into this story, let us know where you're watching from and subscribe for more tales like this one. We upload every day at the same time. Jack felt his heart hammer in his chest the instant he saw the horse stumble through the swirling white. The animal's flanks were streaked with fresh blood that mingled with the snow collecting on its coat. He hadn't expected any living thing to be out in this brutal cold, let alone a Mustang that looked like it had come straight from a nightmare. Gusts of wind howled past, flinging stinging particles of ice against Jack's exposed cheeks. He pressed his ragged old coat tighter to his skin, but the biting chill seeped through every thread. He looked around frantically, seeing nothing but endless white. There was no one else here, just him, the wind, and a wounded horse that should have been fleeing from him but remained there, trembling, as though something far more terrifying lay behind it. Hunger gnawed at Jack's stomach, a familiar ache he had learned to ignore after many days with scant meals. He had been scrounging at the edge of a small ghost town a few miles back, gathering any leftover scraps he could find, but a sudden turn in the weather had forced him to seek shelter in the remnants of what might have once been a supply shack. The walls were half-rotted, offering only marginal protection from the plummeting temperatures. When the horse lurched forward, nostrils flaring in desperate fear, Jack recognized an echo of his own situation in those dark, agonized eyes. It was as if the Mustang was silently begging for help. He swallowed his fear and approached, raising his hands in a gesture of peace he had once used when breaking horses during a short stint at a ranch in his earlier years. He was no stranger to the body language of frightened animals. The horse's ears lay flat, its entire posture taut with panic, but it was too injured and exhausted to bolt. Blood trickled down its shoulder from what looked like claw marks, each gash deep enough to signal a vicious attacker. Jack couldn't imagine what predator had caused such damage, but out here it could have been a mountain lion or even a rogue wolf. Desperation in the Mustang's eyes struck him like a blow to the gut. Jack's throat tightened as he inched closer, ignoring the biting wind that scoured his face. He whispered soothing words he hadn't spoken in years, a gentle hush meant to calm. The horse snorted, tossing its head, each exhalation a misty cloud of steam. Jack could see that if he didn't help soon, the horse might not last the hour in this cold. He set aside a deep-rooted worry that had accompanied him for months, where he would find his own next meal. None of that seemed to matter now. All that mattered was the life standing before him, trembling in the snow. He reached out, heart pounding. The Mustang flinched, but didn't move away. In the dim light filtering through the storm, he could see the horse's eyes rolling with pain and terror. Step by step he closed the distance until he could touch the creature's muzzle, stroking softly to show he meant no harm. A part of him couldn't believe the horse hadn't bolted, but its injuries must have been severe, draining its will to run. Jack knew that if he didn't act quickly, the horse's wounds would freeze into the horse's coat, leaving it prone to infection, or, worse, making it an easy target for any circling predators. He had minimal supplies, a crude sleeping bag that was more holes than material, a couple of scavenged blankets, and a battered canteen partially filled with lukewarm water. Yet something in him refused to abandon the Mustang. He'd spent nights, alone under this sky too many times, relying on scraps and distant memories. A sense of empathy, maybe even guilt, fueled his resolve to save this creature. Though the storm battered them both, he coaxed the horse to follow him toward a small indentation in the ground, a natural hollow near the shack that offered some shelter from the wind. One stumbling step at a time, he guided the horse to a spot where the wind seemed to break, swirling overhead but not assaulting them quite as violently. His breath poured from his lungs in heavy rasps, every intake of frigid air stinging his throat. The horse's legs wobbled with each stride, and Jack worried the creature might collapse entirely before he could tend to the wounds. He rummaged in his pockets, searching for anything he could use. A torn piece of cloth, the edge of an old shirt he'd kept for kindling, was all he found. With trembling hands, he tried to brush snow and blood away from the horse's side. The cloth soaked red instantly. His fingertips felt numb, but he kept going, pressing gently around the open cuts to see how deep they were. The horse let out a low, agonized groan that resonated through Jack's very bones. He thought back to a time when he had worked as a ranch hand, living in a bunkhouse with half a dozen other men. their days filled with the routine of feeding, grooming, and breaking horses. He'd been good at it once, but life had a way of chewing people up and spitting them out. One bad decision led to another, and soon he found himself without a stable job, drifting from place to place. He'd lost nearly everything but the clothes on his back. Now in this brutal snowscape, he was face to face with a living reminder of the one connection he ever truly understood. He swallowed hard and set about comforting this horse, every motion driven by an old forgotten muscle memory that reawakened in the face of crisis. The wind shrieked in sudden fury. He huddled closer to the Mustang, hoping his body heat might keep the animal calm. The shack he'd been using for shelter was too small and too damaged to house a horse, but perhaps they could find a corner where the roof still stood. The challenge was coaxing the frightened creature inside. The horses. Ears flicked back and forth, each gust of wind making it shiver. Jack kept his voice low and steady. He gently tugged the makeshift bandage around the horse's wounds, staunching the flow of blood as best he could. There was no time to think about proper first aid out here. Survival was the priority, his own and now the horse's. Slowly, with soft whispers and calming gestures, he got the Mustang to move with him toward the shack. The building creaked ominously under the strain of the storm, parts of its roof missing. Inside, the wind still sliced through the gaps in the walls, but it was better than being completely exposed. Jack cleared a spot, pushing aside some broken boards and old debris, creating just enough room for the horse to stand without stepping on nails or shards of wood. He guided the animal in, praying the structure would hold. The horse's sides heaved with each pained breath. Jack ran his trembling hand along its neck, feeling the hot breath wash over his skin as the horse tried to steady itself. In the corner of the shack, Jack had a small fire pit of sorts, just some rocks arranged in a circle with burnt embers from a previous attempt to ward off the cold. He had very little dry tinder, but he had to try. Without warmth, he and the Mustang would freeze in this storm. He knelt down, hands shaking, breath fogging in the icy air, and began to strike an old flint against a piece of metal. Sparks flew, each one seeming to taunt him as they vanished too quickly. He refused to give up, willing his numb fingers to keep working. Finally, a spark caught on a piece of rag he'd torn from his shirt days ago. A tiny flame flickered, threatening to die out instantly. He coaxed it with the gentleness of a parent soothing a crying child, leaning in to breathe life into the fragile glow. The flame grew, casting a weak light against the wooden boards. He fed it more scraps of cloth, little bits of paper, anything he could find. Soon, a small but determined fire crackled, illuminating the horse's coat with a golden shimmer. Jack carefully positioned himself between the flames and the horse, letting the warmth wash over his frozen limbs. The Mustang took a step closer, drawn by the heat, though it trembled at the unfamiliar scent of smoke. Jack could see the horse's wound clearly now, jagged tears along the flank, likely from some predator's claws. The flesh was raw, and he knew infection was a serious threat. But out here there were no antibiotics, no bandages, and no veterinarian to help. It was just him and the horse against the storm. He turned his attention briefly to the opening in the shack, peering out into the swirling whiteness. The wind's roar never let up, and he had the nagging feeling that something was out there. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, primal instinct warning him that in this wilderness desperation had many faces, wolves, cougars, or even the peril of the cold itself. He had to keep this fire alive. If it went out, they'd lose. Their only line of defense against the freezing temperatures and any predators that might be stalking close by. The horse let out a soft snort, and he could feel it trembling against him. He took a moment to run his hand over its neck, feeling the coarse hair and the powerful muscles quiver beneath his palm. He let out a ragged sigh, lifting his gaze to the battered ceiling where snow drifted through a gap. Memories of a time when he had a bed, a steady paycheck, and a dream of owning his own ranch came flooding back. This was not how he envisioned his life, barely scraping by in the wilderness. And yet here he was, thrown into an impossible scenario. Any rational person might have abandoned a wounded wild horse and tried to save themselves, but he couldn't. Every time he looked into the Mustang's eyes, he saw the same fear, the same desperation, and the same faint spark of hope he felt in himself. Maybe this horse was a reminder that even in the bleakest of storms, a connection could form, a reason to keep fighting could emerge. As the hours passed, he stroked the horse's mane and whispered calming words, half expecting the creature to bolt or lash out at any moment. But it stayed close, as if accepting his presence. Jack realized the Mustang was running purely on adrenaline and exhaustion. He needed to do more, find some way to treat those wounds. But the storm's fury made leaving the shack impossible. He had no real medicine, no real plan, just a dwindling fire and scraps of cloth for dressings. His own stomach growled, and he cursed the hunger that gnawed at him. Yet he knew that worry paled compared to the immediate danger of freezing to death. When the wind shifted, he caught a different sound, distant but unmistakable. Howls echoed across the frozen landscape. His heart pounded harder. It wasn't just one wolf, but several. A chorus that grew louder, carrying across the howling wind. The horse flicked its ears, eyes going wide. Jack tensed, feeling the primal panic set in. Wolves were cunning predators, and a wounded horse would be an easy target. He didn't know how far off they were, but the sound was enough to send ice through his veins. He gently rose to his feet, scanning the gaps in the shack's walls. The darkness outside was almost absolute. Snow whipped against every surface, creating ghostly shapes that danced in the corners of his vision. But he couldn't see the wolves. Yet, his hand tightened around a makeshift spear he had carved from a broken table leg, and an old hunting knife he'd found months ago. It wasn't much, but out here, it was all he had. The howling resumed, closer this time, more insistent. He thought of the horse's bloody flank, and realized the scent of blood would travel far in this wind. Wolves were hungry in winter, more ruthless than ever. A wave of fear rolled over him as he considered how to defend both himself and the Mustang if a pack decided this shack was their next hunting ground. The horse snorted, stamping a hoof in agitation, the sound echoing hollowly on the wooden floor. Jack tried to steady his breathing, but his mind was racing. He needed to keep the fire alive, keep the horse calm, and stay on guard against a threat that could slip in from any direction. He pressed his ear to one of the gaps in the wall, listening through the keening wind. Another howl rang out, and his stomach sank. Survival, it seemed, was about to get even more complicated. He braced himself, the old fear of being alone in the wild resurging tenfold, now that he had a wounded companion that couldn't run. As the storm raged on, the shack groaned under the assault, and Jack whispered a prayer he wasn't sure anyone would hear, hoping that he would find the strength to face what might come next. He quietly cursed the fact that he was only one man, half-starved and ill-equipped for this merciless land. Yet in his desperation, there was a small ember of determination, a spark similar to the one keeping his fire alive. He refused to abandon the Mustang, refused to leave it to the wolves. Gently he placed a hand on the horse's flank, feeling the tremors racking its body. Hang on, he thought, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to the horse or himself. Hang on, because this night is going to be a long one, and we have no choice but to endure it together. The storm hammered relentlessly, snow piling higher around the shack until the lower half of the door was buried. Jack's limbs shook from the cold. He hadn't slept in over a day, his exhaustion magnified by worry and adrenaline. The Mustang breathed shallowly, its eyes half-lidded as if it was close to passing out. Jack was all too aware of how fragile life was here. No one would come looking for a homeless drifter like him. No search party would scour the plains for a wild horse. They were completely alone, two living souls in a frosty void. In the face of the howling wind, the encroaching wolves and the unyielding cold, Jack resolved to fight with every ounce of strength he had left, not just for himself, but for this wounded creature that had come to him in its darkest hour. This was a grim pact forged in a storm's fury, and he would see it through. The fire sputtered, nearly dying, and he scrambled to add more scraps. As the embers glowed, casting flickering shadows, he glanced at the Mustang's wounds again. Dark, rivulets of blood still oozed from beneath the cloth. He knew infection was a genuine threat, but right now that worry was overshadowed by the immediate need to keep predators at bay and the freezing cold from claiming them both. Another howl cut through the noise of the wind, and Jack gritted, his teeth knuckles going white around his makeshift spear. He had to be ready for anything. In this vicious dance of survival, there was no room for hesitance. He rose to his feet, ignoring the protest of aching muscles and the wave of dizziness that came from too little food and too much cold. The Mustang watched him with frightened eyes, and Jack realized they were both relying on instincts honed by desperation. The night stretched on, and he stood guard, every nerve frayed, hoping the dawn would come soon. When the first faint light of morning finally struggled through the storm, the howling outside had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. Jack hoped the wolves had moved on to easier prey, but he suspected they were still out there, lurking. The horse let out a pained sigh, as if it too was waiting for a reprieve that might never arrive. Jack fed the last bit of cloth he had into the fire, determined to keep some warmth in that shack. And in the glow of embers and the thin rays of early light, he wondered if the bond he had forged with this horse might just be enough to see them through the next wave of challenges. Neither of them was safe, but they were alive, and for now, that would have to be enough. He didn't know then that this was only the beginning of a trial that would push him to his limits. The storm would rage on, the wolves might return, and every moment would demand strength he wasn't sure he had, but he felt that faint spark, the same that kept the Mustang standing on trembling legs. Maybe this shared adversity would become something powerful, a reason to hope. And if there was one thing Jack had learned from his years wandering alone, it was that sometimes hope, however small, was all that stood between life and oblivion. He dragged his ragged blanket closer around himself and kept the horse company, inhaling the scent of wet fur and smoke, each breath a reminder they were still here, still breathing. With dawn creeping in, he silently promised the Mustang that he would do everything in his power to keep them both alive. Jack drifted in and out of an uneasy doze, head lolling, but every time the horse shifted or the wind picked up, he jolted awake, spear clutched in his shaking hands. The cold was merciless, seeping into his bones, yet each time he glanced at the wounded Mustang, a steely resolve filled him. Together, they had already survived the worst night he'd ever experienced. If they could endure that, maybe they could face whatever else this frozen land had in store. And in that fragile lull, as the storm outside began to shift toward a new day, he found the faint beginnings of courage stirring in his chest. Courage that would be tested again and again before this ordeal was over. He exhaled slowly, letting the tension melt from his shoulders just for a moment. The battered shack groaned as a gust of wind pressed against it, but it held, and for now, so did he. Holding onto the Mustang's mane for warmth, Jack closed, his eyes bracing himself for what was to come, unknowingly stepping into a journey of survival and companionship that he never could have imagined. His last thought before the next wave of wind rattled the walls was that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as alone as he had always believed. He drifted into a fitful half-sleep, not noticing that outside, faint tracks in the snow had begun to fill. The wolves might be gone, or they might be circling. For the moment, though, exhaustion claimed him, and he and the Mustang were cocooned in a fragile, fleeting peace that would be shattered soon enough. Jack stirred at the sound of snow collapsing off a nearby branch. The horse snorted, startling, him fully awake. The wind had died down a fraction, letting a bit more light filter through the cracks in the walls. He realized he needed to get moving, to find food, to check for predators, to somehow improve their odds of making it through another night. The Mustang turned its head to watch him, and he made a silent vow he would not break. No matter how dire things got, he would not leave this horse behind. He pulled his collar up, steeled his resolve, and prepared to face the relentless wilderness once again, unaware that the real trials were only beginning. He felt a pang of hunger twist in his gut, but he ignored it. Survival wasn't about comfort. It was about clinging to life any way you could. He adjusted the makeshift bandage around the horse's wound, tightening it to slow the bleeding. A tired look passed between them. Then Jack ventured outside, bracing himself against the cold, spear in one hand, heart pounding like a drum. The day was gray and bleak, snow piled in drifts as high as his knees. Each step was a labor, his feet frozen in worn-out boots. Still, he moved forward, aware that every second wasted could be a second lost in this precarious struggle. He had to find something, anything, to keep them going. And so, with the storm easing, but the danger still lurking, he set off into the biting morning, determined to fight for a tomorrow that, just hours earlier, had seemed impossible to reach. He left the horse behind in the shack, trusting that it was too weak to wander far, and silently praying that no predator would find it before he returned. His breath plumed in front of him as he scoured the white landscape for tracks, food, or any sign of salvation. He was a solitary figure in a vast wilderness, carrying the weight of a wounded creature's survival on his shoulders, uncertain if he could even ensure his own. But he trudged onward, each step a testament to the thin yet unbreakable thread that bound him to hope. Jack's journey across the snow would be fraught with hidden dangers, each new step uncovering a deeper layer of fear and resilience he hadn't known he possessed. In time, he would realize that the Mustang was more than just a wounded animal, in need of help. It was a reflection of his own battered soul. But that understanding and the trials that would forge it lay just beyond the distant horizon he now marched toward, spear in hand, eyes wide, heart pounding, determined to come back alive. He pushed ahead, struggling against drifts that reached his thighs. His breath was ragged and his stomach clenched painfully, but he kept going. He couldn't fail the horse. Failure out here meant death, not just for him, but for the one being that had placed its trust in him, however unintentionally. The day was young, the storm somewhat abated, but Jack knew winter's fury could return at any moment. If he found nothing soon, he'd have no choice but to return empty-handed, with even fewer resources to survive the next night. Still, the lingering howls from the previous night echoed in his memory, spurring him forward. He had no illusions about his place in the food chain out here. The elements had teeth, the predators had claws, and all he had was a flimsy spear and a will that refused to break. He couldn't afford to let fear consume him, because fear was a luxury for the safe and comfortable, and he was neither. His mind raced, scanning for any knowledge he once had about surviving off the land, gleaned from old ranch stories and the occasional library book he'd read during better times. But out here theory felt woefully inadequate. This was raw, unforgiving reality. He pressed on, praying for a break, something that would keep him and the horse alive for just one more day. Jack's feet were numb, but he felt the heartbeat of desperation propelling him forward. He didn't realize it yet, but he was forging the bond of a lifetime, one that would demand every shred of courage and willpower he had. Jack stumbled back into the shack, nearly collapsing from exhaustion. His search had yielded meager results. A handful of frozen berries clinging to a briar patch and a few dead branches he could add to the fire. He'd seen no sign of wolves or other predators, but he felt eyes on him at every step. The hush of the winter wasteland was unsettling, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Inside, the Mustang stood, a pitiful sight with blood-matted fur and trembling legs. Jack's heart sank. There was no hay, no grain, nothing a normal caretaker would have for a wounded horse. All he had was a handful of half-frozen berries and a hope that maybe the horse could nibble on the bark or dried grasses he'd passed on the way back. He approached slowly, slipping off his gloves to let the horse smell his hands. "Easy, easy," he murmured. The Mustang let out a soft sound, shifting its weight away from him, but it was too weak to truly resist. Jack offered the berries he'd found, and the horse eyed them uncertainly before taking them with a shaky mouth. He couldn't help but smile, a small triumph in the face of overwhelming odds. At least the Mustang had enough strength to eat, even if it was just a morsel. He cleared a patch of old straw from a corner, leftovers from who knew how many years ago, and tried to make a softer place for the horse to lie down if it needed to. Every muscle in his body ached from trudging through the snow, and a relentless fatigue weighed on his eyelids, but he forced himself to stay alert. As he fed a few branches into the fire, the shack filled with crackling light that cast dancing shadows on the horse's coat. He saw anew how deep those claw marks were. His makeshift bandage was soaked through. He needed clean cloth or the wound would fester. He silently cursed his lack of resources. There was no going back to civilization. It was too far, and the storm had made any path out treacherous. Even if he managed to traverse the distance, the horse would never survive the journey in its current state. That left him with one option: endure somehow. His mind whirled with questions about how he would keep them both alive, but each time he looked into the horse's eyes, he felt a flicker of determination that countered the hopelessness. His vantage point near the gap in the shack let him keep watch outside. Snowdrifts reached nearly to the windowsill, but the sky was lighter now, and for a moment he dared to hope that the worst of the storm was behind them. He rubbed his hands briskly, trying to get feeling back into his numb fingers. The Mustang shifted, and he turned to find it staring at him with a plaintive expression, almost like it understood their mutual plight. The bond forming between them was unlike anything he'd experienced. For years he'd been alone, drifting, expecting nothing and receiving less. Now, in this desperate situation, it felt like fate, or some cruel twist of the universe, had thrown them together. Exhaustion pulled at him, but he knew he had to stay vigilant. He fought the urge to close his eyes for more than a moment, knowing that wolves or another fierce predator could strike at any time. He recalled those distant howls and pictured lean silhouettes moving through the white, ears perked, nostrils flaring at the scent of blood. A chill ran through him, colder than any wind. He felt for the spear beside him, verifying it was within arm's reach. He would defend this horse, even if it cost him his life, because to do otherwise would be to succumb to a darkness deeper than any winter night. Time seemed fluid as the day wore on, the sun never truly breaking through the slate-grey clouds. Jack rationed the few berries he had between himself and the horse, washing them down with sips of melted snow. His stomach growled angrily, but he had learned long ago how to ignore hunger pangs. The Mustang needed nourishment more than he did. When the horse tried to lay down, he helped ease it onto the straw, taking care not to tear open the wound any further. The horse shuddered with pain, its breath shallow. He bent close, examining the gashes, and tried to wash them with a bit of melted snow. The animal flinched, but he whispered reassurance, tears pricking the corners of his eyes as he realized how helpless he truly was. He thought about life outside this storm, how people sat by warm fires in cozy homes, oblivious to the struggles of a homeless man and a wild Mustang fighting for survival in some forgotten corner of the wilderness. That world felt impossibly distant now, a dream he once had. A wave of bitterness threatened to overwhelm him, but he clung to the present. Self-pity had no place here. There was only the moment, the next breath, the next heartbeat. The horse snorted softly, as if urging him not to dwell on what he couldn't change. He nodded, feeling a strange kinship. Maybe they could endure if they worked together somehow. Outside, the sky darkened again and the wind began to pick up. Fresh snow started to fall. A curse escaped his lips. Another storm front approaching so soon. They barely had any fuel left for the fire, and his body felt like lead. But there was no choice. He had to brace for another onslaught. He stood, ignoring the protest of cramped muscles, and checked the cracks in the shack's walls. Where he could, he stuffed rags or old pieces of wood to block the wind. It wasn't much, but every little bit helped. The Mustang followed his movement with wary eyes, flaring its nostrils whenever the wind gusted through a new gap. Jack's mind raced with contingency plans he barely believed in. If the storm intensified, maybe he could huddle with the horse. In the corner, share warmth. It was a pitiful plan, but out here, pitiful might be the best he could manage. As dusk fell, the light inside the shack grew dim, and the fire's glow became their only illumination. Each flicker of flame revealed the worry etched on Jack's face and the tension rippling through the horse's trembling body. Fatigue settled into every joint, and he fought to keep his eyes open. Sleep beckoned seductively, but he knew slumber could be a death sentence. He forced himself to nibble a small piece of bark he'd peeled from a branch, anything to keep his jaw moving, to remind himself he was alive. The taste was bitter, the texture awful, but it was something. The Mustang, sensing his agitation, let out a low whinny. Jack reached over and rested a hand on the horse's flank, feeling the slow, labored rhythm of its breathing. In that moment, a piercing howl cut through the air, setting his nerves on edge. The horse jerked upright, ears standing tall. The wolves were out there again, or maybe they'd never left. Jack's grip tightened on his spear. Fear coiled in his stomach, but he breathed in and out, refusing to let terror paralyze him. If they came, he would fight. He wouldn't let them claim the Mustang. He glanced at the horse, and though it was just an animal, the shared look felt like an understanding. They were both in this together, come what may. Another howl came, then another, forming a chilling chorus in the darkness. The Mustang's eyes rolled, and Jack whispered a gentle hush to steady its frantic breathing. The howls seemed closer now, echoing just outside the shack. Jack pictured the wolves prowling around, sniffing out weaknesses, licking their chops at the scent of fresh blood. His heart thundered in his chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. Fear would do nothing but hamper his reaction time. He motioned for the horse to stay still, though the poor creature didn't need encouragement. It was too exhausted to flee. He moved to the shack's entrance, positioning himself so that any wolf trying to enter would have to face him first. The spear felt laughably inadequate in his hands, but it was all he had. He hoped the firelight would deter them, at least for a while. Minutes passed like hours, each one filled with the tension of waiting for an attack that might never come. The howls died down, replaced by the roar of wind and the crackle of the fire. Jack's breath came in short, sharp bursts. After what felt like an eternity, he heard the crunch of paws in the snow outside, a low growl, then silence. The wolves were testing them, perhaps uncertain whether their prey was worth the fight. His hands trembled, but he gripped the spear. Tighter, a silent vow forming in his mind. Over my dead body, he thought. He would not stand aside and let them slaughter the Mustang. In a strange way, this horse had become his purpose, maybe his penance, for all the mistakes that had led him to a life on the run. Time slogged by, measured in heartbeats. The wind howled, the shack groaned, but no wolf burst through the entrance. Gradually, the tension in Jack's shoulders eased, but it never vanished entirely. He remained coiled, like a spring ready to snap. If they tried again, he would be ready. The Mustang, sensing a slight reprieve, settled back down, shuddering with each breath. Its eyes were half closed, worn out from fear and pain. Jack knelt beside it, pressing his forehead to the horse's neck for just a moment. If this was all the comfort he could offer, then so be it. They were two lost souls clinging to life in a place that punished weakness mercilessly. He stoked the fire, feeding the last of the branches he'd gathered. Sparks danced upward, vanishing into the gloom. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, no certainty that they'd see another sunrise. The wolves might simply be waiting for him to drop his guard. The storm might intensify, burying them alive. Or the horse's wounds could become infected, leaving it delirious with fever. Each possibility weighed on him, a chain of dread clamped around his neck. And yet, in the midst of all that terror, he felt something else, determination. This was his life, this horse's life, and he would not let either be snuffed out without a fight. Finally, exhaustion overpowered him, and he slumped against the wall, spear resting within arm's reach. He dozed fitfully, waking at every minor sound. The Mustang dozed too, occasionally stirring with a low nicker as though haunted by dark dreams of claws and fangs. Outside, the wind continued its mournful song. The hours of darkness stretched on endlessly, but each moment that passed without an attack felt like a small victory. If they could just hold out until dawn, maybe they'd stand a chance. When the first pale light of morning crept through the cracks in the shack, Jack opened his eyes to find the horse watching him. Weak though it was still alive. He let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. They had survived another night in this frozen hell, but he knew they weren't safe. The Mustang needed more care, and the wolves were likely still out there. The wind had gentled, but the cold was as merciless as ever. Grimly he rose, scanning the small interior of the shack with bleary eyes, forming the next plan. Survival was a chain of small decisions out here, each one critical, each one shaping whether they lived or died. And as he looked into the horse's exhausted gaze, he silently vowed he wouldn't fail. He steadied himself with a deep breath, snatched up his spear, and prepared to face another day in a world that had no pity for the weak. Jack's entire body was stiff, as though every muscle had been locked in tension for hours. The wolf threat had become a relentless background concern, a ticking clock in a survival scenario already stacked against him. He shook out his arms, trying to fight off the numbness settling in his limbs. The Mustang still breathed, though each exhalation was laced with quiet pain. There was no way he could leave the horse alone for too long, but he needed to gather more wood, find any scrap of food, and maybe, if luck was on his side, materials to better bandage the horse's wounds. But luck was in short supply in this unforgiving place. Stepping outside, he felt the full brunt of the cold slam into him like a solid wall. He braced against it, spear in hand, scanning the horizon for any sign of movement. The vast white plain stretched out endlessly, and the silence pressed in, on him, broken only by the crunch of his steps. Each time the wind gusted, it carried with it that primal dread, a memory of howling predators and near-freezing nights. He forced his feet to move, ignoring the pain that shot up his ankles with each step. The drifts reached his knees, making progress excruciatingly slow. Still, he pushed forward. He walked in wide arcs around the shack, searching for anything that might have been exposed by the storm's shifting winds. Occasionally, he found small branches or clumps of brush that he could use for fire. He piled them atop a crude sled he'd fashioned out of a broken piece of wood and some rope he'd salvaged. It wasn't much, but it was better than trying to carry everything in his arms. Once he spotted what looked like rabbit tracks, but he was in no condition to chase or trap anything at this point. Without proper bait or equipment, going after the rabbit would be a futile waste of energy. So he trudged on, face stinging, lips cracked from the cold. A sense of desperation kept creeping in. Even if he could keep the fire alive for another night, they had no real food to speak of. The berries were all gone. The horse needed proper treatment for those wounds, and he was miles away from any possible help, even assuming help existed. Yet, for reasons he couldn't fully articulate, he refused to abandon the Mustang. Maybe it was the memory of what it felt like to be left with no one to turn to, the humiliation of being invisible to a world that prized success and despised failure. He couldn't do that to another living being, even if that living being was a wild horse that had no ties to him beyond the happenstance of a storm. He forced himself to press on for several hours, scanning trees at the edge of a low ridge, hoping to find some hidden resource. The land yielded very little, but he managed to scrounge a bit more kindling. He wrapped what he could in cloth to keep it as dry as possible. Occasionally he paused to catch his breath, leaning on the spear. His vision blurred with fatigue, but he couldn't afford to give in. The Mustang was counting on him, whether it realized it or not. Before turning back, he glimpsed a set of tracks in the snow, fresh wolf prints heading south. His heart lurched. They were definitely in the area. He had to hurry back. By the time he returned to the shack, dusk was already creeping across the horizon, painting the sky a dreary purple. He found the horse standing shakily, peering out the open doorway, as if it had been waiting for him. The relief in his chest surprised him, an actual surge of emotion that stung his eyes. He couldn't remember the last time he felt cared for or needed. The horse nickered softly, and he nodded, stepping inside. He dropped the wood in a corner, quickly moved to tend the fire, and checked on the horse's wounds. The bandage was crusted with dried blood and ice. He replaced it with strips from his own shirt, wincing at how the horse flinched at every touch. Then the temperature started dropping again, a reminder that winter's cruelty was far from over. He stoked the fire, feeding it bit by bit, careful not to waste any fuel. Outside, the last light vanished, plunging the land into darkness. The wolves howled again, just once, enough to make his blood run cold. He clutched his spear and positioned himself by the doorway, determined to keep watch through the night. The Mustang stood beside him, leaning against his shoulder as if it drew strength from his presence. In that moment, man and horse formed an unspoken alliance. Survival demanded nothing less than total unity. The hours crawled by, every snap of a twig or distant rustle of wind setting his nerves aflame. He peered through the gaps in the shack, ready for gleaming eyes or a sudden rush of predators. His fingers ached from gripping the spear so tightly, but he refused to relax. The Mustang, for its part, clung to consciousness, occasionally letting out a deep, shuddering sigh. Jack suspected fever might be setting in. The horse's hide felt too warm to the touch, and a thin foam gathered at its lips. He cursed under his breath, wishing for even the simplest medical supplies. Out here, all he had was determination. Finally, in the dead of night, the wolves made their move. Jack heard them before he saw them. Soft padding of paws on the snow, cautious but intent. His pulse thundered in his ears as he pressed his back against the horse, spear held forward. A shadow flickered at the edge of the firelight, then vanished. The Mustang shifted nervously, eyes wide. Jack whispered soothing words, never taking his gaze from the gloom outside. Another silhouette passed by, bolder this time, stepping into the faint glow. A wolf, lean and hungry, its fur matted with ice, its lips curled back, revealing gleaming fangs. Jack forced himself to take slow, measured breaths. The horse stomped. Once, an anxious movement that echoed in the shack. The wolf growled, ears flattened, but it didn't charge. It was testing them, assessing risk. In the corner of his vision, Jack spotted another pair of glowing eyes. The pack was here, circling. His grip tightened around the spear. He stepped forward just enough to show he wasn't easy prey. The wolf growled again, but it didn't advance. Behind it, a second wolf emerged, hackles raised. The standoff stretched, each side waiting for the other to show weakness. A third wolf darted closer, snapping its jaws. Jack lunged with the spear, forcing it to leap back. The Mustang let out a high-pitched whinny, eyes rolling in terror. Jack used his body to block, the horse heart-hammering. His muscles burned from tension, and the firelight played havoc with shadows, turning the wolves into shifting wraiths. In a burst of nerve, the first wolf lunged, fangs flashing. Jack thrust the spear, catching it in the shoulder. The wolf yelped, twisting away. Another snarled, snapping at Jack's leg. He kicked out, connecting with its muzzle, pain lancing up his foot. The Mustang tried to rear, but its injured flank gave out, causing it to stumble. Time became a blur of violence and desperation. The wolves darted in and out, quick as ghosts, attacking from all angles. Jack swung the spear wildly, scoring hits where he could, but his arms were heavy and the cold sapped his strength. The Mustang lashed out with a feeble kick, striking one wolf in the ribs. That wolf yelped and retreated. Embers from the fire scattered as Jack accidentally kicked the stones, sending sparks flying. The flash made the wolves recoil for a moment, buying him precious seconds to regain footing. But they regrouped, circling again, eyes glinting with predatory hunger. Jack roared in defiance, brandishing the spear. He felt something snap inside him, a raw surge of protectiveness that overcame his fear. If these wolves wanted a fight, he would give them one. He advanced a step, forcing them to reconsider. Behind him, the Mustang panted, trembling with pain and adrenaline. Another wolf dove in from the side, teeth aiming for the horse's flank. Jack spun just in time, ramming the spear into its side. The wolf let out a choked yelp and stumbled away. Blood spattered across the snow. The other wolves snarled, uncertain. They could sense their packmate's injury. For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the pack scattered, melting into the darkness as quickly as they appeared. Jack stood there, spear raised, panting hard, refusing to believe it was over until the night fell silent. Only the wind and the crackle of the fire remained. His legs nearly gave out, but he braced himself against the wall, sweat mingling with the freezing air, to chill him to the bone. The Mustang sank to its knees, flanks heaving. The threat had passed for now, but the wolves might regroup. He couldn't let his guard down. With trembling hands, he checked the horse for new injuries. Aside from a few shallow scratches and more terror in its eyes, it seemed no worse off than before. Jack's own limbs were covered in bruises. His coat was torn, and a trickle of blood ran down his forearm from where a wolf's teeth had grazed him. The pain was a searing reminder of how close they had come to death. He forced himself to gather snow in a rag to press against the wound, cursing under his breath at the sting. Infection was a real concern, but there wasn't time to focus on himself. The horse needed comfort. He turned and placed a shaking hand on its neck, whispering soothing nonsense. The rest of the night was a vigil of fear and exhaustion. Jack refused to sleep, knowing the wolves might be lurking. He added the last of the wood to the fire, stoking it as high as he could to keep the darkness at bay. The horse seemed to sense his determination, leaning its head against him as if trying to share what little warmth they both had. Outside, the wind picked up, swirling snow into ghostly shapes that danced across the threshold. Each swirl made Jack's heart jolt, expecting another wolf to emerge. But dawn found them alive, battered yet unbroken. The Mustang stirred first, testing its wounded leg. Jack gingerly checked the claw marks he'd bandaged. They were raw, but hadn't reopened, significantly during the scuffle. He exhaled a shaky breath. They had survived another lethal encounter, forging their bond in the crucible of violence. Maybe the wolves would think twice before attacking again, or maybe they'd come back with greater force. He didn't know. All he knew was that for one more morning they were still breathing, still together. He stepped outside, scanning the horizon. The sky was cloudless, an icy blue that almost seemed serene if not for the bitter chill. The tracks left by the wolves were scattered, some stained with droplets of blood. He doubted the predators were gone. More likely they were licking their wounds, waiting for another chance. Jack shuddered at the memory, then forced himself to think of the present. The Mustang needed food, so did he, and they both needed a plan beyond just surviving night to night. With the sun up, maybe he could venture farther, find some place with better shelter, or at least a vantage point. But the horse was too weak to travel any real distance. He chewed his lip, wrestling with indecision. Abandoning the horse was unthinkable, yet staying here was a slow death sentence. In the end, he resigned himself to another day in the shack. He dragged the carcass of a fallen tree he found nearby, hacking at it with his knife to create more firewood. It was back-breaking labor, and he was half frozen and bleeding, but he got it done. The Mustang watched him from the shack's doorway, head low, breath misting in the cold air. When he finally finished, Jack staggered inside, body on the brink. Five collapse. He let the door swing shut, blocking out the wind. The horse let out a low nicker, and he couldn't tell if it was a greeting or a lament. Collapsing by the fire, he pressed his back to the wall, hugging himself for warmth. A wave of nausea hit him, the slow creep of shock and exhaustion. He closed his eyes, counting his breaths, trying to gather the strength to do something. Anything more. But he found himself drifting, lulled by the flickering flames. Every muscle in his body cried out for rest, and he surrendered to a stupor that was half sleep, half delirium. Now and then he jolted awake, expecting to see wolves at the threshold, but there was only the battered shack and the Mustangs. Soft breathing. Time blurred, the day crawling by in a haze. He barely moved except to feed the fire. The horse rested too, occasionally stirring or shifting its weight. Both of them were worn down to the bone, and the storm of the previous night had proven just how dire their predicament was. As evening approached, he sat up, gaze drifting to the horse. Its eyes followed him. In that silent exchange, he found a spark of purpose. They were alive, they'd fought, they'd won. A corner of his mind marveled at how this horse, once a wild creature with no reason to trust him, now looked to him for security. The unspoken bond that had formed was a fragile lifeline in a world determined to snuff them out. And for all the hopelessness swirling around them, that simple fact gave him the strength to stand, gather his spear and prepare for another uncertain night. Because if they could endure just one more day, there might be a future for both of them. And so he braced himself, body aching, spirit unwilling to break, as the sun faded over the horizon once again. Jack watched the horse drift into a fitful doze, its head dropping low, eyelids fluttering with every gust of wind that leaked through the shack's cracks. It pained him to see the creature suffer. He turned his eyes to the dwindling fire, stoking it with what wood he had left. Night was coming yet again, and with it the unknown. They had no guarantee the wolves wouldn't return, no promise the cold wouldn't take its toll. Even if they survived, infection loomed like a vulture, ready to claim the horse's injuries or the gouge in Jack's arm. Still, for a moment, he let himself feel a quiet appreciation for the simple fact that they had lived through another day. The battered shack was becoming a fortress of sorts, albeit a fragile one. Jack had packed snow along the outer walls to block some of the frigid wind. He had used spare bits of wood to brace the half-collapsed roof. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. The Mustang's breathing sounded more stable now, though it trembled when the wind roared. He'd done his best to keep the wound clean, though his options were limited. Each time he peeled the makeshift bandage away, fresh blood glistened. He cleaned it with snowmelt, carefully patting it dry with the last of his salvageable cloth. The horse tolerated it, though the pain was evident in every twitch of its muscles. After rebandaging the wound, he settled beside the horse, tentatively resting a hand on its neck. The Mustang leaned into him, and he felt the coarse hair beneath his fingers, still matted in places. It was a moment of connection in a landscape dominated by indifference. Jack closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. Memories drifted back to his childhood, how he used to run through fields on a relative's farm. He recalled the sense of freedom and possibility he felt as a boy, how the wide-open, Sky seemed to promise endless adventures. Life had led him astray, whittling away at his spirit until he found himself homeless and alone. Now faced with mortal danger, he felt a faint spark of that boyish wonder return, a testament to how adversity could sometimes awaken dormant parts of ourselves. He was snapped out of his reverie by a muffled thump outside. Tensing, he grabbed his spear, heart racing. He waited, breathing shallowly, every sense on edge. Another thump, then silence. It could be a branch falling from a tree under the weight of snow, or it could be something else. Carefully, he positioned himself near the door, peeking through a gap. The cold night was pitch black, offering little visibility. His eyes strained. He thought he caught a glimpse of movement, but it was too dark to be certain. The Mustang sensed his tension, stirring uneasily behind him. Long moments passed without further sound, though the wind gusted, tossing snow in swirling eddies. Jack maintained his vigil, refusing to let his guard down. Survival in this place was a constant high alert. Finally, convinced the noise was just a trick of nature, he returned to the horse's side. He could almost sense its relief as he lowered the spear. They were both exhausted, battered, and in no shape to fight off another onslaught. Yet they had no choice but to remain ever watchful, for danger didn't care about their fatigue. Danger came whether you were ready or not. Time dragged, and Jack wondered if dawn would ever arrive. The Mustang drifted in and out of a light sleep, its ears twitching at every subtle sound. Jack stoked the fire whenever it began to wane. His own eyelids drooped repeatedly, but each time he nearly dozed off, an image of snapping wolves jolted him awake. Each second was a battle against unconsciousness. The bitter cold helped keep him vigilant, a perverse blessing in a place where warmth was scarce. At some point, the horse let out a low, distressed whinny. Jack placed a soothing hand on its neck, feeling how clammy the horse's skin was. Fever, he thought again. The horse's eyes were glassy, unfocused. Panic fluttered in his chest. Without proper medicine, the horse might not survive. He tried to offer a trickle of melted snow to its muzzle, and it drank a little, though most of the water dribbled off its chin. Jack pressed his forehead against the Mustang's, breathing in the scent of fur, sweat, and faint blood. Hang in there, he thought, not daring to say the words aloud, lest the universe overhear and decide otherwise. The shack rattled under a strong gust of wind, and Jack heard the distant cracking of ice. Winter had fully sunk its claws into this land, and they were trapped in its grasp. His mind raced with possibilities. Could he risk a longer journey to find help, leaving the horse alone? Unthinkable. By the time he returned, if he even survived, the horse might be dead from blood, loss, infection, or wolves. Could he remain here indefinitely? Also impossible. Food was nearly non-existent, and he was already at his limit. The Mustang needed more than he could provide. He needed a miracle. He gnawed at his lip, contemplating the next move. Perhaps there was a small town somewhere close by, a place he could reach in a day's travel, but he hadn't seen so much as a dirt road in miles. All that remained of the old settlement he'd passed through were broken walls and burned-out vehicles, none of which offered supplies. He shook his head, feeling despair gnaw at his resolve. Then he felt the horse gently nudge him, as if sensing his turmoil. The subtle push against his shoulder reminded him that giving up was not an option. Waves of exhaustion finally overwhelmed him near midnight, and he slipped into an uneasy sleep, huddled between the horse's flank and the wall. Vivid nightmares plagued him, wolves with fiery eyes, deep snow swallowing him whole, the Mustang collapsing into a void. He jolted awake more times than he could count, each time adjusting the fire, each time reaffirming the vow to stay alive. By the time early morning light began to creep in, he was more weary than ever, but they had made it through another night. No wolves attacked, no catastrophic collapse of the shack buried them. The horse was still breathing, though unsteadily. He forced himself to his feet, ignoring the aching protest of every muscle. Morning might offer a slim chance to gather resources, to test the surroundings once more. But as soon as he opened the door, a stark reality greeted him. The entire area was buried under fresh drifts, some as tall as his chest. The shack itself was partly entombed in snow, and icicles hung from the edges of the roof. Any hope of a long trek for supplies vanished at the sight. Even if he tried, he'd be wading through waist-high drifts. The horse, in its weakened state, would stand no chance. A grim determination settled over him. If they were stuck here, he'd have to make the most of it. He set about creating a small windbreak with chunks of snow, piling them against the shack's most vulnerable side. Then he ventured a short distance to gather any branches or brush exposed by the changing winds. Every step was a struggle, each breath a raspy testament to his frayed energy. But giving up was not in his nature, especially not now. By mid-morning, he'd amassed enough wood to keep a small fire for another night, assuming he rationed carefully. When he returned, the horse was struggling to stand. It had tried to move outside, probably driven by instinct to find feed or water. Jack rushed to its side, supporting its flanks, easing it back down. The horse whinnied, a mix of frustration and pain. Jack's eyes burned. This horse was a proud creature, built for running across open fields. Now it was trapped, battered, forced to rely on a man who barely had the means to save himself. The injustice of it stung, but he swallowed his anger and did what he could, checking the wound, offering water, whispering encouragement. Hours passed in a haze. He melted snow for the horse to drink. He scraped bark off branches, hoping it might offer some fiber to the Mustang's empty stomach. He himself hadn't eaten anything substantial in days, but the horse needed every scrap more than he did. The day was mercilessly cold, the temperature never rising enough to melt even a fraction of the snow. Late in the afternoon, Jack saw a brief flash of sunlight break through the clouds, touching the horse's coat with a halo of pale gold. For a moment, the image lifted his spirits, reminding him of a world beyond this endless winter. But the clouds closed in again, sealing away the light, and he returned to the cramped gloom of their refuge. That night, Jack braced himself for another siege, but the wolves stayed away. Perhaps their earlier confrontation had persuaded them to seek easier prey. Or maybe they were just biding their time. Jack never fully relaxed, cradling the spear by the fire, nodding off in short bursts. The Mustang occasionally jerked awake, letting out a frantic breath, only to settle again. This dance of half-sleep and high alert continued until the first streaks of dawn stretched across the sky. He was beyond exhaustion, running on survival instincts alone, but they were still alive. That small miracle was enough to propel him into another day. He ventured outside once more, looking for anything missed in previous searches. A lone bird took flight overhead, a dark shape against the pale sky. He watched it vanish over the trees and wondered how a creature so small could survive here. When he returned to the shack, his breath caught in his throat. The horse was standing on wobbly legs, head lowered, making its way toward the door. Jack rushed to support it, but the horse nudged him aside with surprising resolve. It looked outside, ears perked, nostrils flaring at the crisp air. Its coat was still matted, the wound partially scabbed but obviously painful, yet something inside it was pushing it to move. With delicate caution, Jack let the Mustang step out. It stumbled, nearly crashing into a drift, but then regained, balance leaning against him. He guided it around the perimeter of the shack, letting it sniff at the snow. The horse tried to paw at the ground, maybe searching for buried grass. He wanted to tell it there was nothing here but ice, but there was no point. This was part of the horse's natural instinct, the drive to seek sustenance. After a few minutes, the horse's legs began to shake again, and he gently coaxed it. Back inside, where it collapsed onto the straw bedding with an exhausted groan, Jack felt a lump in his throat. The creature was fighting so hard, yet the odds were stacked against them both. He knelt by the horse's side, stroking its neck, his own stomach rumbling from hunger. He was losing weight rapidly, cheeks sunken, eyes shadowed. But every time he considered leaving, the memory of the horse's frightened gaze held him back. They had forged a bond in blood and snow, a bond he couldn't sever without betraying his own sense of decency. Even if he died out here, at least he'd die knowing he tried. That resolve was all that kept him going. Another day passed in much the same way, scavenging for wood, rationing the fire, tending to the horse, always listening for the dreaded sound of wolves. As dusk fell, He rested his head against the horse's flank, feeling the soft rise and fall of its breath. The Mustang was asleep, or close to it, lulled by the flicker of the flames. Jack stared into the fire, memories drifting back. Scenes of laughter with ranch buddies, gentle breezes rolling over grassy fields, the smell of leather and manure in the stable. He remembered the quiet satisfaction of a horse responding to his commands, the shared communication that came from mutual respect. He blinked away tears. This was his reality now. He, the drifting outcast, and a wild Mustang clinging to life. Perhaps this was the second chance he never knew he needed, an opportunity to reclaim some lost part of himself. Outside, the wind whistled, but no howls accompanied it. The night stretched on peacefully, if one could call it that. He and the Mustang both slipped into fitful rest, waking intermittently to stoke the fire or check for dangers. When morning came, Jack discovered the horse nudging the shack's door again, as if it wanted to try standing outside. This time, Jack was ready. He steadied the horse's flank, helping it step carefully onto the snow. The sun was a pale disk in a grey sky, offering little warmth, but at least there was light. The horse limped forward, testing its leg. Despite its visible pain, it seemed determined to walk. Jack accompanied it, spear at the ready. They didn't go far, just a few feet around the shack's perimeter, enough for the horse to stretch its muscles. Then they returned inside, each movement labored, but also a step forward. Afterward, Jack sank to the ground beside the horse, panting from the exertion. The horse's flank heaved, sweat darkening its coat. Yet through the pain there was a spark in its eyes, a silent vow not to give up. Jack felt his own resolve deepen. Maybe they could outlast this nightmare. Maybe there was a path to salvation if they just held on. And so it went. Day after day, night after night, they defended against the cold, the lurking wolves, and the creeping despair. Each small sign of progress, like the horse managing a shaky walk, bolstered Jack's spirit. He told himself that if he could keep the Mustang alive, he might somehow find a renewed purpose in his own existence. Now and then, the howls returned, distant but menacing. Sometimes he saw dark shapes on the horizon, but the wolves never launched. Another full assault. Perhaps they sensed his newfound determination, or maybe they were waiting for a moment of weakness. Regardless, he stayed vigilant, never leaving the horse unguarded for long. His world shrank to the confines of the shack and the surrounding drifts. His days were an endless cycle of gathering whatever meager resources he could, tending the horse and fighting off exhaustion. At times, he felt close to collapsing. He started to think in terms of immediate goals. Find enough wood for one more night, melt enough snow for one more drink, check the horse's wound one more time. The Mustang, for its part, showed remarkable resilience. Though its progress was slow, the fever eventually subsided, and the wound began to scab over. The horse regained a bit of strength, enough to stand longer each day and nibble at whatever roughage Jack could find beneath the snow. Each small victory felt monumental, reminding Jack that miracles could happen, even in the harshest conditions. Gradually, the snowfall eased. Days passed without fresh accumulations, and the howling wind died to a low moan. Jack noticed patches of ice thinning, revealing glimpses of the earth below. It wasn't spring yet, not by a long shot, but a shift was coming. He found areas where the sun had melted enough snow to uncover tough winter grass. The horse grazed. On these scarce patches, like a starving prisoner, offered a morsel of bread. Jack took that as a sign. Nature was relenting, if only a little. Time began to lose its edge, blending in an unbroken sequence of survival tasks. The horse grew steadier on its legs, though it still bore deep scars along its flank. Jack's own wound on his arm had crusted over, leaving an ugly scab that throbbed when he used his arm too much. Still, they pressed on, forging a life of necessity in the broken shack. By the time the days began to noticeably lengthen, both man and horse had endured more tribulations than he cared to remember. Eventually, Jack realized the moment to leave might be drawing near. With the snows receding and the horse's strength returning, they could attempt to find a safer place, maybe even a real settlement. He knew it would be a gamble. Predators, uncertain weather, the distance they'd have to cover. But they couldn't remain in this ruin forever. The shack had served its purpose, keeping them sheltered through the worst of the storm, but it was never meant to be a permanent home. Gathering the last of his resolve, Jack made a decision. As soon as the horse was able to walk a bit farther, they would set out together, forging a path through the remnants of winter, in search of a chance at real survival. One crisp morning, he looked at the Mustang and knew the time had come. The horse stood steadily, ears forward, as if ready for a challenge. Jack felt a lump in his throat. This was it, the culmination of everything they had fought for. The shack had become a place of transformation, where fear and desperation had given way to a bond stronger than either could have anticipated. Now they would take the next step, literally and figuratively. He packed up what little he had, a few makeshift tools, his spear, and some cloth for bandaging. It wasn't much, but it was all he owned in this world. The horse watched him, giving a quiet nicker as if in approval. He led the Mustang out, and together, they stood in the pale sunlight surveying the landscape. The snow still lay thick in patches, but there were pathways of frozen earth that promised slightly easier travel. With cautious optimism, they started walking, leaving the shack behind, forging ahead into the unknown. Jack felt the horse's weight shift against him with each step, still limping, but no longer helpless. He recalled his vow not to leave the horse behind, and he smiled. They were in this together, come what may. The wind was cold but manageable, carrying the faint smell of pine and distant water. Jack inhaled deeply, letting the crisp air fill his lungs. This was the taste of freedom hard won, and he savored it. They moved slowly, step by painstaking step, forging a trail across the thawing plain. Jack kept the spear in hand, scanning for any sign of wolves or other threats. The Mustang stumbled occasionally, but each time it found the strength to rise. Their pace was that of survivors, unhurried, determined. Ahead lay uncertainty, but behind them was a testament to the will to live. In silent camaraderie, man and horse pressed onward, leaving footprints in the softening snow, each track a reminder that they had refused to be beaten by the storm, the cold, or the predators that lurked in the shadows. That, in itself, was a triumph, a testament to the raw power of survival. As they ventured farther from the shack, Jack began to notice subtle changes in the landscape. The snowdrifts weren't as tall, and patches of dull brown grass emerged wherever the sun's rays could penetrate. A small creek, half frozen, trickled in the distance, its surface shimmering with ice crystals. The horse's ears twitched at the sound of running water, and Jack guided it over, letting it drink. He bent to wash his own face, ignoring the stinging. Cold as it bit into his skin, it felt refreshing, a small luxury after so many days of half-melted snow in a battered pot. He stood, wiping his mouth, and gazed at the Mustang, which was slowly lapping at the creek. The scars along its flank were healing, though clearly visible, a permanent reminder of the predatory attack that nearly ended its life. He sighed, recalling that frantic night when he had first bandaged the horse in the heart of a raging storm. So much had changed since then. In place of fear, he now felt a sense of kinship, almost reverence, for the creature that had taught him about resilience and hope. They had battled the wilderness together, forging a bond unbreakable by fangs or frost. His stomach grumbled, reminding him that survival would still require strategy. The horse needed grass and rest, and he needed food beyond bark and frozen berries. If he could follow the creek downstream, there was a chance he might stumble upon a deserted cabin or an old trapper's hut. People often built near water, and though the area seemed mostly abandoned, he clung to any thread of possibility. He patted the horse's shoulder, murmuring, "Let's keep going," before turning to follow the creek's winding path. The horse complied, walking a bit more confidently now, though still favoring its injured leg. They traveled for hours, the sun creeping higher in the sky, melting the top layer of snow into a slushy mix that made every step a challenge. Jack trudged onward, spear in hand, eyes sweeping the horizon. Birds circled overhead, occasionally swooping down to land on the banks. He took that as a good sign. Birds meant potential for small game, maybe even fish. If the creek were deeper downstream, he might try his luck at fishing, though he had no rod, just his knife and some basic survival skills. The Mustang pressed on beside him, occasionally stopping to nibble at clumps of grass. He let it graze, grateful the horse was regaining strength. At one point, he thought he spotted movement in the distance, a flash of grey weaving between the trees. His heart jumped, recalling the wolves. But the shape vanished, and no howls followed. Perhaps it was just a coyote or another harmless animal. Nevertheless, he remained on edge, scanning every shadow. The wilderness was vast, and they were still vulnerable. The Mustang seemed to sense his tension, lifting its head with ears alert. Jack patted its neck, communicating a silent caution. They continued, each footstep sloshing through the thaw, each breath a reminder they were alive. By midday, he noticed the creek widening, cutting through a shallow ravine. The banks were steep in places, but manageable. He helped the horse navigate a tricky slope, the creature slipping once before regaining balance. Finally, they emerged onto flatter ground, where the creek opened into a small frozen pond. Jack paused, noticing footprints in the mud near the edge. They looked human, though partially washed out by melting snow. His heartbeat quickened. Could there be someone else out here? Maybe a hermit, a hunter, or just another wanderer like himself. Cautiously, he followed the footprints along the pond's perimeter, the Mustang staying close. The prints led to a crumbling dock, half submerged in ice. Beyond it, nestled among a cluster of evergreens, stood a dilapidated cabin. Jack exhaled in relief, though he remained wary. The cabin might be abandoned, or it might harbor someone who didn't appreciate visitors. Still, this was the best lead he'd had since leaving the shack. He approached slowly, scanning for any sign of movement. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar. Snow drifted high against the siding. No smoke rose from the chimney. It appeared deserted. He motioned for the horse to stay, though the Mustang seemed reluctant. Sword, no spear, in hand, he stepped onto the porch. The wood creaked under his weight. With one strong push, he nudged the door open, revealing a single-room interior littered with broken furniture and scattered debris. Dust swirled in the faint light. No fresh footprints marked the floor, suggesting no one had been here recently. He lowered his spear, heart still racing, and moved inside. The place smelled of mildew and old wood, but to him it was a castle compared to the shack. A quick search revealed a rusted stove, a busted cot, and cabinets with doors hanging off. Their hinges. No obvious supplies remained, but maybe something had been overlooked. He rummaged through drawers, finding only a few rusted cans, their labels peeled away by time. The cabinets yielded nothing more promising, some mouse-chewed cloth and broken plates. Disappointment settled in, but he tried not to let it crush him. At least the cabin offered sturdier walls than the shack. He thought about the horse out there in the cold. Could it fit inside? Possibly, if he cleared some space. He wasn't sure if the floor would hold its weight, though. Alternatively, he could dismantle some walls or build a makeshift lean-to for the horse outside. First, he'd have to assess the structure. He turned to see the horse standing in the doorway, muzzle extended tentatively, ears flicking. It snorted, stepping over the threshold as if testing the floor. The boards groaned, but held. Jack chuckled softly. "Guess you're tired of being alone out there," he murmured. The Mustang glanced around, each breath stirring dust motes in the stale air. Jack stroked its neck, guiding it carefully around broken chairs and debris. They settled in the corner, where the floor seemed most intact. He stood back, hands on his hips, surveying the cabin. A battered stove could provide heat if he could get it working, or at least if he could burn wood inside. He'd need to clear the chimney, though. That became his next task. He climbed onto a shaky chair, peering into the stove's chimney pipe. A bird's nest blocked part of it, along with other debris. Grumbling, he set to work clearing it, hands caked in soot. Meanwhile, the horse tested the space, stepping gingerly but managing not to panic at the unfamiliar enclosure. The broken windows let in cold air, but at least the walls were more solid than the shack's. If he could board them up, he might have a halfway decent shelter. Once he cleaned the chimney, he gathered wood from outside, building a small fire in the stove. It smoked at first, but eventually the draft caught, and a steady flame crackled, sending warmth into the cramped interior. Encouraged, he cleared more debris from the center of the room, fashioning a rough bed for the horse using old blankets and straw he found in a collapsed storage area out back. The day wore on, and by evening, a modest glow filled the cabin. The horse lay down with a sigh, the heat from the stove lulling it to rest. Jack sat against a wall watching the flames dance, feeling more secure than he had in weeks. This place, though run down, felt like a turning point. He could almost imagine staying here long enough for the horse to fully heal, for him to recover some semblance of strength. Maybe he'd find better supplies in the surrounding woods, or even attempt to fish the frozen pond once it thawed more. He dozed off, exhaustion overtaking him. In his dreams he was back on the ranch, leading a healthy, unscarred Mustang across a sunlit pasture. Laughter rang out as the horse trotted beside him, free from fear. When he awoke, the cabin was dark, except for the glow of embers. The Mustang was stirring, ears perked as if listening for something. Jack tensed, reaching for the spear. He heard nothing except the crackle of cooling wood. Gradually, he relaxed. Perhaps the horse was just adjusting to new sounds, the groan of timbers and the hiss of wind through cracks. He stoked the fire, adding a few sticks to keep the warmth. As the flames rose, he saw the horse watching him intently, as if it knew this was part of their next chapter of survival. Morning arrived quietly, gray light seeping through the broken windows. Jack yawned, stretching stiff muscles. The cabin was not exactly comfortable, but compared to the shack, it felt like a fortress. The horse rose with difficulty, stepping around the debris. Jack checked the wound, pleased to see it was cleaner, the scabs more defined. He made up his mind to stay at least a few days, maybe more, to let them both recover. If the wolves were still around, maybe they wouldn't venture too close to a structure that smelled of human occupancy. Still, he remained cautious. Over the following days, he established a routine. Mornings were spent checking the area around the pond for food or resources, afternoons reinforcing the cabin, patching the windows and gathering wood. Evenings were for quiet companionship by the stove, man and horse warming their bones while the night world prowled outside. He eventually discovered an abandoned storehouse near the pond, finding a couple of rotted burlap sacks. Nothing edible, but the sacks themselves could be repurposed. Another time, he managed to catch a fish in the thawing creek using a crude spear technique, providing him with the first real meal he'd had in what felt like ages. The horse grazed on patches of grass, slowly regaining stamina. It was a tenuous paradise, overshadowed by the knowledge that winter was far from over. A sudden storm could trap them again, or the wolves could reappear. But each day Jack's body felt stronger, and the horse's limp grew less pronounced. A sense of cautious optimism crept into Jack's thoughts. Maybe they could outlast the cold, and when spring arrived, truly move on to a better place. He even dared to imagine finding a ranch willing to take in the horse, or at least a safe pasture. As for himself, he wasn't sure, but something deep inside told him he might not be a drifter forever. One evening, after securing the cabin, Jack settled beside the horse, listening to the crackle of the fire. The horse gazed at him, its dark eyes reflecting the flames. He thought about all they'd survived, the storm, the wolves, the bitter cold. In that moment, he felt a profound gratitude for this unlikely partnership. A homeless man and an injured Mustang, thrown together by chance yet united in their fight to live. He patted the horse's neck, and the creature gave a gentle nudge against his shoulder, a gesture of trust. A lump formed in his throat, and he closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the fire and the closeness of this companion fill a void he hadn't realized was so vast. Days turned to weeks. The horse grew fit enough to walk further, its wounds healing into scars. Jack's own injuries mended, leaving him with fresh scars as well. Whenever the wind shifted, he found himself checking the perimeter for wolves, but they never came. Perhaps they had found easier hunting grounds or migrated with the herds of deer. Either way, Jack was grateful for the respite. He took to walking the horse around the pond each morning, letting it stretch its legs. Gradually, the Mustang learned to trust him enough to accept a rudimentary halter fashioned from rope. It was the first time in ages he felt like a ranch, hand again, guiding a horse gently, responding to each shift of weight and ear flick. One cool morning, he realized the sun felt warmer than before, carrying the promise of spring. He breathed in the scent of wet earth. The horse lifted its head, nostrils flaring. Jack saw a faint sparkle in its eyes, as if it too sensed a turning point. He led it back to the cabin, but his mind was already spinning with thoughts of the future. If the snow continued to melt, the roads might clear enough to travel. Maybe a functioning ranch lay a few miles off, or a small town. He wasn't certain, but the idea was enticing. Was it time to leave this cabin behind, to seek a real future? That afternoon, he packed what few supplies he had, including some dried fish and a makeshift canteen. The horse watched him curiously. He placed a hand on the doorframe, recalling how they'd first arrived, broken and desperate. Now they were both healthier, though far from unscathed. He glanced at the horse's scars, then at his own. Survivors, he thought, plain and simple. He lifted his spear, his trusty companion through countless nights, and balanced it against his shoulder. Then, with a firm nod, he opened the door, letting bright daylight flood the cabin. They stepped outside, greeted by a crisp breeze and the sight of receding snow. The path along the creek was muddier now, revealing stones and patches of green. Jack led the horse forward, each footstep symbolic of leaving the worst behind. He didn't know exactly where they were headed, but forward was enough. They'd face whatever came next with the same stubborn defiance that had kept them alive this long. Man and horse moved in tandem, forging a trail that wove between bare trees and thawing ground, guided only by instinct and a fragile hope that, somewhere beyond the horizon, lay a chance to start anew. He paused briefly to glance back at the cabin. Smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, the last embers of the fire he had built. For a moment he considered staying, but the call of open fields and the desire for a life beyond mere survival urged him on. He tugged the rope halter gently, and the Mustang followed without protest. As they crested a small rise, Jack felt the sun on his face, banishing the memory of the storm's savage cold. In his mind, the opening chords of a new chapter were already playing, a tune of resilience, companionship, and the enduring bond between two creatures who refused to die when the world turned against them. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, and share it with others who might find hope in it. We upload new tales of survival and courage every day at the same time, and we'd love to hear your thoughts. Let us know in the comments how this story impacted you. And remember that even in the darkest storms, there can be moments that restore our faith in the power of resilience.